Okay, howdy again, guys. Welcome to Accessibility in Aggie Land. This session today is Everyday Ableism, Unpacking Disability Stereotypes and Microaggressions. And we have with us today Dr. Amanda Kraus from the University of Arizona. We are so thrilled that you are joining with us today. Amanda is originally from the suburbs of New York City, and she's lived in Tucson and worked at the University of Arizona for nearly 20 years. She serves as Assistant Vice President for Campus Life and is the Executive Director for Disability Resources and ADA 504 Compliance Officer. She's the UA's Disability Resource Center, is one of the largest in the nation and considered an international model of progressive service delivery, uniquely positioned to approach campus excessive proactively and systematically. Dr. Kraus is also Associate Professor of Practice in Higher Education, where she coordinates the MA program and teaches courses on student services and disability in higher education. Dr. Kraus is president of the Association of Higher Education and Disability, AHEAD, Board of Directors, and previously chaired its Standing Committee for Diversity. She has had the privilege of speaking and consulting with campuses such as Singapore Management University, Duke University, and Wake Forest University. She was recently invited to join a delegation convened by the U.S. Department of State to engage in dialogue on disability access in education and employment in Beijing, China. Dr. Kraus earned her MA and PhD at the University of Arizona in higher education. Thank you, Dr. Kraus, again for being here today, and I will hand off the microphone to you and Dr. Orr.
So I just wanted to give a quick thank you to the Association of Former Students who have provided funding for this event. We really appreciate it and appreciate your support. And I think Kelly is here with us today, so we're happy that you could be here to be able to listen and to learn from Amanda. And I am going to turn it over to my good friend and wonderful presenter, Amanda Kraus.
Thank you so much, Megan and Christy, for the invitation. I'm so happy to work with you all today. And thanks everyone for joining us. I know that it's the end of a pretty wacky semester, kind of a challenging time. So I appreciate you all wanting to come together and talk and think about ableism and disability today. I have my chat window open and I will monitor the chat. And I know that Christy and Megan will also be doing so. If you have questions or reactions throughout, the next hour, please pop them into the chat, and I will do my best to get to everyone, and hopefully this can be somewhat interactive as we go through the content. So thank you. Let's see, I have one window, so I'm going to move everybody around so I can see everything on my own screen. But, I think important to a conversation on ableism is first a bit of reflection on how we have been essentially socialized or conditioned to think about disability. So I start every presentation or every conversation even really with a quick look at kind of how disability has been framed and is framed most commonly in society, and then some ways that we can start to reframe it. And when I say we, I am really referencing kind of an American Western perspective, and I mean disabled and non-disabled people alike. And I'm disabled, I use a wheelchair, which would be apparent to you if we were together. And so I really want to make that point that if we've grown up here and if we're living here, we've all been socialized with the same messages about disability, which is kind of an interesting dimension to this conversation on ableism that we'll talk about. So how is disability traditionally framed? This slide really presents a summary of a number of models or approaches that should be familiar to us all. So historically and today, disability tends to be framed as a physiological difference, diagnosis, injury, or impairment that renders the individual at a deficit. And so essentially we look at that deficit and we want to cure it, right? That's kind of medical model thinking. We want to fix or cure the deficit or the person. We pity the person, right? Because this deficit is not, this difference is not neutral. It's a deficit. And I'm Italian and I talk with my hands, but I will do this a lot. One down, one up, put my hand up for one up, hand down for one down, kind of thinking about power dynamics. And so, we're not looking at this physiological difference as neutral. We're really looking at it as a deficit. And because of that, we pity, right? We offer a kind of charity to the person in response to this deficit. And then even legally, we're looking at this deficit and we accommodate it, right? So that's all of our training on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. We've been taught, a compliance response to disability. And so when we want to respond to disability, we look at accommodations. So all of these approaches have something very important in common, that they localize or they locate disability within the individual, right? So it's an individual's problem. And this individual is perceived as disabled by their impairment. So because of this physiological difference, something different in my body or my brain, that's why I'm disabled. And of course, when we think about disability in these ways, that's going to inform our approach to access, right? Which is what many of us are working toward in higher ed. And I saw, in the chat earlier, folks from disability resources, instructional designers, I saw advisors, and, that's really what we're trying to do, right? When we're working with any student, is figure out an accessible experience. So through these lenses, we would approach access as something that is individual, because we're responding to this person and their difference. Access is medical, right? Services, treatments, cures for these differences. Access is charity, right? I just feel so bad for this person. I just pity them, and I want to help, right? And access is legal. I have to do this. We are bound to, the ADA requirements. We have legal obligations, right? And I just want to kind of say, like, as I'm hearing myself, none of these approaches are entirely bad or entirely good, right? But what they have, again, in common is that they frame disability as an individual's problem and an individual's responsibility, and they frame access in these ways. So emerging thinking on disability, which is really, several decades old at this point, comes from the disability community, comes from, disability activists, is that the environment disables people with impairments by design. And, we're talking about ableism today, so that framework should feel familiar to us, right? As we think about other social justice kind of experiences, when we think about dominant and subordinated group experiences, I think we're a little bit better at understanding those barriers as environmental or systemic. I don't think that we are really good at understanding those issues, but I think we're better at applying that systemic framework to other experiences than we are to disability, because of all of that thinking with which we've been socialized. So here, rather than the individual being the problem, it's the environment that's the problem, right? The environment has been designed in ways that exclude or oppress or discriminate against certain folks. And today we're talking about disabled folks and the disability experience, the disability community. So here we're really appreciating that disabled people are disabled by design. And we have to understand that there are differences between impairment and disability. So impairment is something physiological. It is a personal difference. Disability is bigger. And that's where our conversation on ableism kind of takes shape. Disability is, a phenomenon with far-reaching political, social, economic, educational implications. So, there's always going to be, in my case, using myself as an example, I'm always going to have this impairment, right? I don't want to not have my impairment, contrary to larger kind of ableist thinking on difference, right? But I may or may not be disabled. And the ways that I think about that is like, for me as a chair user, I might not be disabled if the environment is designed with no barriers in the physical environment, right? But also disability is an identity and it's a political experience. So I might not claim that identity, right? For a lot of reasons, but there are differences between impairments and disability. And that's what I hope to really talk through today and shed some light on. So when we're looking at this emerging thinking in this right-hand column, rather than understanding access as something that's individual, medical, charity, or legal, we can start to appreciate that access is a right. If we're really placing that responsibility in the system, right, in the structure, in society, in the environment, then we can look at really who's excluded and who's included. So access does become something that we can consider a right. And again, we're coming together here as colleagues in higher education, and we can appreciate that students have all been admitted to our university by the same competitive standards. They are then held to the same academic and behavioral standards as everyone else once they're enrolled. Similarly, employees are all hired by the same competitive standards and practices and held accountable, to the same workplace performance measures. Yet, disabled people have a very different experience oftentimes with very basic access on all of our campuses, right? Because we're still working toward disability equity and equity in general. Higher ed isn't that old, right? So it's a few hundred years old, and it was literally designed, for a very small subsect of white, affluent Christian men, not to get degrees, but just for their own personal edification. And so, 500, 600 years later, we're still coming out from that, right? Higher ed is exclusive. It was designed that way. So we're still really trying to make the college university experience inclusive and accessible. So when we think about, marginalized groups, historically marginalized groups that have been marginalized from lots of different aspects of society, we're going to have to work a lot harder in higher ed, right, to undo some of the damage that has been done. So, when we're looking at access and we're looking at our campus community, everyone is qualified, right? Everyone belongs. So what we want to try to look at as we start to think about disability equity and ableism is, how do we create similar, if not identical, experiences for disabled and non-disabled people with respect to basic access, right? So I'm not talking about everyone having the exact same experience. I'm not talking about erasing differences or ignoring characteristics that are important and unique. I mean basic access. Sitting in the classroom, parking the car, taking an exam, having a safe workplace, workstation. So that's where, I think shifting the conversation away essentially from individual access toward equity and kind of systemic inclusion is really helpful. So how are we doing so far? Let me check the chat. Doing okay? Feel free to pop, a comment or question into the chat. I'm looking at it now. All right. So I've mentioned, we want to shift this conversation to that of social justice. And I don't think we readily include disability in these conversations for a lot of reasons, right? I don't think we've had a lot of practice or opportunity in thinking about disability as something bigger than or different than a problem or a deficit or something that is individual. And those of us who have been trained, to really interpret the ADA have probably been trained to do that very narrowly. So happy to make this individual accommodation. Right? So that's not social justice. That's an individual accommodation. That's access. And I do want us to appreciate access does not equal equity. These are not the same end results. They're both good, right? And I think access exists on a spectrum. And when we make an individual accommodation, it's probably not going to be universally accessible, or we probably will not have removed the barrier systemically. We're making a one-off individual accommodation. However, if we think about it, conversely, if we really work to remove a systemic barrier, we work to promote universal design, we're probably going to also be compliant. But we have all, I know, have been trained to just, we make individual accommodations. That's how we respond to disability-related barriers. So really, when I read these definitions, I would love to invite you, to think about disability as contextualized and framed and shaped by these concepts. So social justice is a society that affords all groups full and equal participation, equitable distribution of resources, where members are safe. Social justice is a process and a goal. Privilege, unearned benefits that are bestowed upon someone based on membership or perceived membership in a dominant group. So for today's conversation, we're going to talk about non-disability privilege, just kind of categorically. There are lots of dynamics within the disability community, but for the sake of this, relatively short and kind of big picture conversation, we're going to be looking at non-disability privilege. But there are lots of different power privilege dynamics in the disability community, just like there are within other communities, subordinated communities. So I use a wheelchair, right? So I might not have mobility privilege, but I have hearing privilege, speaking privilege, seeing privilege, right? So there's nuances. Power, what these benefits yield. Oppression, discrimination, bias, lack of power or access experienced by members of a subordinated group. Oppression can be institutional. And I think at this moment in time, we are doing a lot of reflection on and kind of reconciling or reckoning with how racism has been institutionalized into every system in the United States. And I think we can also appreciate that ableism has been institutionalized. And if we think about, and we will together over the next little while, how ableism shows up in higher ed, it's pretty hard to argue. It's pretty hard to unsee it. Oppression can be individual, and we will talk a bit about microaggressions. And, microaggressions tend to be one-on-one interactions, whether they're, comments or behaviors or gestures. But that's where I see, I think, a lot of examples of individual oppression is kind of with microaggressions. And oppression can be internalized. So, when you are a member of a subordinated group, chances are we've internalized some of the negative or disempowering ideas that are really popular or agreed upon in our society. So this might be the internalized ableism, might be why students don't want to come to the Disability Resource Center to request accommodation or explore, access. Internalized ableism might show up in, I might not feel comfortable dating in college, or, putting myself out there for opportunities because I'm really grappling with and maybe struggling with reconciling my identity when all the messages that I get are so consistently negative. Finally, a definition of ableism, a system, a belief structure, that advantages non-disabled people. Again, sweeping kind of big picture definition, but essentially a set of beliefs, systemic decisions, behaviors, policies that in essence advantage non-disabled people, right? And disadvantage disabled people. I've mentioned the term socialized like a lot already today, and this is not anything formal. This is my own way that I make sense of this process. So here I use a lot of smart art. So here is just a little graphic kind of indicating a process moving from one to the other. The title of this slide is socialization. So where do these contemporary experiences come from? Right? We're talking about ableism, we're talking about discrimination, oppression. Well, they come from our shared history. So disabled people have a shared history of oppression that we will talk about very briefly in the next slide, I believe. This history has laid the foundation for the stereotypes and the biases that unfortunately, really limit or set very kind of rigid parameters on the disability experience today. Microaggressions reflect this stereotypical thinking. Microaggressions enact these biases. So reflect the ableism, the agreed upon kind of norms, if you will, around disability. Microaggressions are simply a reflection of our societal beliefs. So, and that's why microaggressions are tricky, right? Because they're not always meant to hurt someone, right? They're not always intentional. In fact, more often than not, they are unintentional, but yet they reflect and they reinforce ableism. Ableisms will also, microaggressions will also impact our professional practice. So there are a lot of ways that higher education continues to center the non-disability experience and other disabled people. So all of this continues to create the experience, right? Continues to create the experience. And so it's a cycle really that needs to be disrupted. And it's not an easy task, right? Because so many of us really do have ableist beliefs, myself included, right? Disabled people included. Even really nice people, even really good non-disabled people have all been socialized in the same ways. So some of this process is like a real commitment to unlearning and to disrupting ableist thinking and ableist practice. I mentioned a very quick overview of disability history.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, my watch says it's not sure that it understands, but me neither. So disabled people do share a history of oppression. It's not a history that we tend to learn about, generally in history classes or in American studies. It's not something that we really look at. And I think even if we did, or when we do, it kind of fits, right? Like we don't think critically about it. And so much of this history continues to manifest today. I think the legacy of this historical treatment is still very much alive and well in contemporary society. So I have a list of kind of treatments, how did society respond, right, to disability? Well, in pretty egregious ways, through exploitation of disabled people, experimentation, sterilization, institutionalization, through euthanasia, and really through kind of eugenics broadly. And there's a few images that I'll describe here to give some examples of that. So the first image is a black and white photograph, and it says "Human Freaks Alive," main sideshow, Human Freaks, and there's a crowd gathered around a stage. And of course, the circus or the sideshow or the freak show has a really interesting role in disability history because it's certainly representative of being marginalized, being exploited, but it was also work. So it was also, an opportunity for disabled people to make money, very complicated, right? Representing a lot of tourism, a lot of othering, kind of that, if folks are familiar with Stella Young's TED Talk about, quote, inspiration porn, where she coins that term, and she defines it as the objectification of disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. So you can kind of see the origins of some of that inspiration, maybe linking all the way back to the circus and the sideshow. The next image is a sketch of someone being burned at the stake. So, I mean, this is back thousands of years, but not an uncommon way to respond to, what might be psychiatric disability, difference publicly, right? To say, this is how we handle this kind of behavior, right? We're going to publicly burn you at the stake as some sort of punishment. There's lots of kind of morality dynamics and religious dynamics that are tangled up in that set of behaviors. The next image going around clockwise is the inside of an institution. It's a black and white photograph where you can really just see cots just really crammed in to a room. And institutions, were allegedly ways to protect disabled people, but also enacted pretty, upsetting ideas about what disability meant and what disabled people were. They're a burden on them, on society, on their families, so we should put them away. This is the only place where they can get good care. There are still a few functioning institutions in the US today. But in the 70s, there was a kind of that initial understanding that these institutions were actually abusive, they were exploitative, they were neglecting people. And so they started to be shut down. But it is hard to reintegrate when you have systematically removed like an entire group of people from mainstream society. And the last image is a chart from Nazi Germany, just indicating lots of different symbols of people, groups of people who were targeted. And of course, disabled people were targeted. So I would just, again, invite you to reflect on, no, we're not burning people at the stake anymore. Even circuses are kind of fading out. Institutions are not common practice, but can you appreciate the legacy of these behaviors, right? And that might be connecting, again, the sideshow to the telethon, right? That might be connecting institutions to self-contained classrooms in public school, right? There are lots of connections that we could make, but we first have to understand this history. And I think once you can appreciate that disabled people, like other subordinated groups, share a history of systematic and intentional oppression, that's the first step to understanding ableism. It comes from somewhere, right? And these are some of the historical roots. So how do these ideas manifest today? I have a list of negative and quote unquote positive stereotypes. So the negative column says disabled people are tragic, right? Disability is a tragedy. Disabled people are pitiful. Disability is scary. Disabled people are lazy. They're liars. And those two, I think, go together, and maybe we can identify with some of that in our work in higher ed, right? They're lazy. That student doesn't need accommodations. If they tried harder, they wouldn't need extended time, right? If they, just worked a little harder, maybe they could handle their depression better, right? They're liars, right? These two ideas are really interconnected. They're liars. I don't believe them. I need to see documentation. I need to know, right, for sure that they're not lying, that they're not cheating. So these ideas, unfortunately, I think are very important in understanding how disabled people navigate the exclusive and competitive environment that is higher education. Disabled people are angry, right? And it's like, yeah, I'm angry. I'd like to think not all of the time, but I would say anybody who identifies as a member of a subordinated group can probably access some of that anger sometimes. Disabled people are deficient. They're less than, right? This makes them less important. The next thing, they're undeserving, right? There's something inside of us that really struggles with maybe concepts of disability pride or community. So the next the next column says, quote unquote, positive. Disabled people are inspirational, right? They're heroes. They're special. They're resilient. Now, contrary to the first slide, they are deserving, right? So it's like on one hand, they're undeserving. We don't want to do anything for them. But on the other hand, they're ultra deserving, right? They deserve preferential treatment. They deserve help and charity and attention. So these messages can be confusing. And I put positive in quotes because, yes, objectively, these words are positive, right? Inspiration is good and special is nice and, helping is good and nice. But it really, it depends on how you're measuring that assessment. So in our society, we expect very little from disabled people. So often, just by doing anything, disabled people are then labeled as inspiring or heroic or special. So are we really using the same standards to assess disabled people? And I would say, no, we almost never are as a society. And we're going to go through here examples of, how we've learned this and where this stuff shows up. But no, disabled people aren't inspiring for doing ordinary things. Yet that is such a common trope, a common representation in media, and seeps into our practice, seeps into our thinking. Even though these ideas are, again, objectively nice, they might be better than that, negative column, they're still informed by bias. So they're still damaging. And I think we do disabled people a disservice, right, in many ways when we label them or use these terms to understand them or disability, right? Like special, this is I think a really interesting one, but none of my needs are special, right? None of my needs are special. I have to show up to school, to campus. I have to park my car. I have to sit in your classroom, take the exam, use the bathroom, read the book. None of those are special needs. But because our entire system has been designed to cater to a certain type of person, non-disabled person, then my needs get framed as special, and somehow that becomes a compliment. So these ideas are really fraught with a lot of bias, a lot of really, I would just say, misguided ideas about disability. We're more than just a little more than halfway through, but let me just check in here. Any questions? Feel free to, ask me something in the chat. I'll keep my eye on it. Feel free, to comment or ask a question. So before we get into this, so I compiled over the years many, many images from the media, right, and from the internet. So media and social media. And I either, right click on something when it pops up, usually Facebook or Instagram for me, or just kind of the news, anything I'm looking at online. Or I have just done an internet search for very simple terms: disability, wheelchair, maybe qualifying it with like help. But my whole goal is just to figure out what's out there, right? So for those of us who are looking up information on disability, maybe we're trying to learn about disability, maybe we're creating something, an event or a poster, and we're looking for information. Really, and this is just some of what I have, but this is what's out there. So we have to, again, now appreciate history of oppression, ableism. Here are these stereotypes, right? Well, where do we get these messages? Well, we get them from the Today Show, right? This says human interest, courtesy of the Today Show. And I just have a couple of these, but I went to the Today Show website and put disability into its own search. And I have a couple of ones to share. And I like the Today Show. You know, that NBC is just my go-to default channel, right? So if I'm gonna watch a morning show, it's always the Today Show, even though I'm almost always offended by the human interest stuff. Because if you really think about it, most human interest pieces are about overcoming something, right? Are about, in many, many, many examples, about disabled people doing something, usually something very ordinary. So this one is this is just right from the website. It's a photograph of an older, I'm going to assume a 69-year-old man. I'm making some assumptions for the sake of describing these images, but an older white man outside on a farm with Mickey Mouse pajamas on. And the headline says, "Man 69 with disabilities gets forever home." Right? Who else gets forever home? Foster animals, rescue pets. Okay. This one I find really interesting. Man with disability travels the world on his friend's back. And there's a photograph of two guys. One is, I think they're both white. One is standing kind of with a fake sword, kind of in a heroic position. His friend is in the guy's backpack. So this one, you know, you're welcome to comment to me, to each other in the chat. With 20 minutes left, I don't know that we'll get, I don't know that I can engage with every comment, but feel free to do that for each other. What I feel like is interesting about this one is disabled people have friends, right? Even though we don't really see that very often, and I'll get into that in the next few slides. So what really is interesting? What makes this national news? If you omitted disability from the headline, it's really a story about two guys traveling together, two friends traveling. As a wheelchair user, I can tell you traveling is challenging. You know, things are not accessible. If this works for these two, I don't really care, right? To me, it's like, cool. If you have this relationship, great. It looks like an outdoorsy kind of trip. So who knows what barriers you're going to encounter. And that might be cool. That might be innovative. When we present it in this way, right? Really centering, I think, how magnanimous the non-disabled friend is, right? What are we really learning? We're not really learning, wow, there are a lot of barriers that would prevent disabled people from traveling independently, right? Which is an interesting and important conversation to have. But what we're looking at is how nice, right, that this friend is carrying his other friend around, right? So again, that's not a bad story. It's the way it's framed, right? Really playing on some of the ideas that we've already discussed and reinforcing some of the microaggressions that we've yet to define for disability. Here's just a few. Before you quit, try. And there's a little, I'm making assumptions for the sake of describing the images, but it looks like a toddler, like a little girl, double below elbow amputee. So she's drawing and she's holding the pencil in her mouth. Before you quit, try. Beneath that first image is another little white boy, double amputee below knee, running on blades. Your excuse is invalid. Right, so again, these aren't for disabled people by disabled people, right? This is what disabled people or non-disabled people think disability is, right? You're here to inspire me. These are two children doing things children do, right? These are not elite Paralympic athletes, right? These are children drawing and running. But if you're not trying, your excuse is invalid, right? If this kid can do it, you could do anything. Then the next image, this is like one of my favorites. Found this on Facebook, saved it. This was on a page of an acquaintance of mine. I wouldn't say that we're friends, but someone I know through the wheelchair sports community. Never ignore somebody with a disability. You don't realize how much they can inspire you. Share if you agree, right? And there's what looks like a white woman in what is almost a hospital chair, alone on the beach, facing away from us, arms out, right? So really, I'm just here to inspire you. So I was like, okay, let's look into like wheelchair. Let's see if this is common. Well, this is 5 images that are almost identical, right? But there are so many more images that are almost exactly like this that it's like weird, right? So what we have here are 5 white adults. Almost all of them are using hospital chairs. They're all outside and alone. So out in a field, out weirdly on a pier facing away from the camera. Arms either up or arms out, right? Almost, you can not really see any of their faces. Almost all of them are facing entirely away from the camera. I'm just looking. Yep, unnatural. Yeah, it's weird, right? So, I mean, wow, thank you. Yeah, I mean, and just go pop onto Google, like put in disability, put in wheelchair, see how many of these images come up, right? So what is this about? They're all alone, right? So that's why it's so interesting that that guy got to travel with his friend. He has friends, right? None of these people have friends. They all are just like outside alone. And I have to imagine that arms up, arms out is some juxtaposition of what we imagine as being confined to a wheelchair must be, right? They're outside, they're living their lives. That makes me as a non-disabled person feel better. This slide's all about helping. So there's a few images of people pushing other people in wheelchairs. There's a few icons, the accessibility icon, one that's being held up by white hands, one where the wheel of the hand is, the wheel of the chair is actually a white hand. So both of those are, cringy. But then the one I want to share or talk about is very recent. This is a screenshot I took from a local Tucson news source. Dick Hoyt, inspirational runner who pushed son's wheelchair for 32 Boston marathons, dies at 80. And there's a picture of him pushing his son, who uses a wheelchair. So I know that this was national news, and I don't know much about the story, but I actually laughed out loud, right, with this headline. Like, was the son in the chair, or did he just take the chair and run with it? Right, that's how little we think about disabled people, right? It's the wheelchair, right, that he pushed. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. So if we want to have inclusive photos in our materials, what kind of photo would be okay? A kid in a chair participating in PE, just doing what all the other kids are? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it has to do with like your larger selection of images and the language that you're using to frame or describe what you're doing. I think one little check, is if this were another diverse experience, another subordinated experience, would I feel comfortable with this image or this language? And, that might be enough for us all, right? Like if this were about a different community, what might the impact be of a photo like this or language like this? So, I mean, I would say just as similar as it can be to what's really going on. If that is a student in class, great. They're in a class, they're with other people, cool, right? What's not cool is like some kid using a chair that's like outside alone where everybody else is like playing at the playground, right? I mean, that would be the assumption. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. Never, never, never give up, right? Really reinforcing the idea that if I was a better person, if I tried harder, if I prayed more, if I worked out more, right, I might overcome But that's not true, right? I'm a good person, I exercise, and I will always have this impairment. So it's really not up to me. But when we continue to situate like limitations live only in our minds, no, they don't. Right? Limitations are structural, they are systemic, they are historical, right? So if we only talk about disability as something that, it's really individual, it's just my attitude, if I tried harder, then everybody else is off the hook, right? Our inaccessible systems and programs and experiences are all, it's fine, they can just work really hard, right? In spite of these barriers. And I don't know that we would use the slogan, limitations live only in our mind, if we were talking to another group, right? Another historically marginalized group. There's another like white woman chair user it's not a hospital chair, but it's pretty darn close, who's just, again, looking away from us, staring at a flight of steps. Like that one cracks me up, because this is really what I think non-disabled folks think disability is, right? That's what using a chair must be, alone in a building that looks closed, looking at a flight of steps, right? So this is all about her. If she just tried harder, right, she'd hop up those steps. This one, there's 8 images. They are all almost identical. They are all featuring the word disability, where the dis is either minimized or smaller or literally crossed out with a red X by a white man's hand in 3 of those images, or, ability is under the magnifying glass. So we never even talk about disability, right? We don't say the word disability. We've developed all these euphemisms over the years, like special needs, like differently abled, like physically challenged, mentally challenged, that we're just still so uncomfortable with the word disability, we go out of our way to call it something else. So when we think about the internalized ableism that I mentioned earlier, like, wow, what a weird thing to reconcile with as a disabled person, that I'm trying to claim this identity, but I can't even say the word without being corrected. This is all about curing. Someone I love needs a cure, support autism research. Not I want a cure, someone I love. Don't worry, my disability isn't contagious, but my smile is, right? Because disability is medical, right? We're all patients. I'm gonna just skip through these for the sake of time. More on curing. A baby hears his parents' voices for the first time. Watch the emotional moment her hearing implant is switched on. How many of these do you see on social media a day? Right, the cochlear implants. Be my eyes, be the eyes of blind or visually impaired people. And those are both advertising technology that blind folks can use to get a description of maybe a new place. Technology is cool. The framing of it is a bit schmaltzy, right? And, there are people who want a cure, and I'm not judging that, right? There are many people, and I think disability is an interesting experience because you can be born with a disability or acquire one. There are a lot of people who want to walk again, see again, hear again, but not all of us, right? And one of the only stories we're ever told about disability is curing it and overcoming it, or, kind of me, what's it called, Me Before You, or $1 Million Baby, or it's a fate worse than death, right? So there's really nothing in the middle. So I'm only saying this to remind us all that disability is a diverse and rich community, and there's lots of different ways people experience it. Not everyone wants a cure, and not everyone wants to end their lives. More curing. Bottom 2 images are interesting to me. These are pretty new. You can see ABC News, People TV, 2 weddings. Again, they look white to me, but maybe not. Hetero weddings, bride, groom. Bottom left, the bride is supporting the groom as they recess down the aisle, and you see his everyday wheelchairs in the background. Next image is the first dance. So what happened here is the groom's a chair user, and his father and best man hold him up under his shoulder so he can dance with his bride. Now, again, like, I don't really care what these people do, right? I'm imagining that these guys are newly injured. This is just where my mind goes. I don't know if that's to be true, but I mean, maybe it is. And they're adapting, right, to being disabled now. What I resent is that it's on ABC News, right? I mean, then it's, you have to walk down the aisle in order to deserve to be married, right? You have to dance standing up because that's what dancing is. I mean, again, like, those are the problematic ideas, that they are on national news, that they're being celebrated for the kindness of doing this for your disabled groom, right? Your disabled son, your disabled brother, and reinforcing that people walk down the aisle and this is what dancing looks like, right? Again, I don't care what these people do in their weddings. I resent ABC News for picking it up and syndicating it all over the country. Superheroes are an interesting vehicle to talk about disability. Superheroes are usually, they're either born with a superpower or they acquire it and they decide how they want to live with it. Like Mystique goes back and forth with being blue, living blue or not. So again, this is like the only way to talk about disability is as a superhero, right? We don't get any ordinary stuff. We get villain. Here's a slide about villains, or superhero. Right, so Scar from The Lion King, Freddy Krueger, Captain Hook. Many villains have impairments, scars, limps, speech impairments that make them scarier. But perhaps the most horrifying image on this slide is the bottom left photograph of an accessible parking spot. Thank you, Christy. Every 48 seconds, a drunk driver makes another person eligible to park here. Not kills someone, worse. Right, disables them. So I feel badly for rushing through this, but maybe it'll be like a good, like, you'll think about it all day, and I'm always available for, conversation and processing. And I'm sure Christy and Megan would be as well. Christy's nodding. So how does this impact our daily lives? Through microaggressions. So this is what we mentioned earlier as one very consistent way that oppression shows up kind of one-on-one. A microaggression, I'm going to assume we're familiar with this term. It is born out of critical race theory, but has, since in the last probably 15 years, been studied in different contexts. So a microaggression is an everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slight, snub, or insult, intentional or unintentional, or negative, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to disabled people based solely upon their perceived or actual group membership or disability status. So what's interesting about that? Verbal or nonverbal, right? That could be a look, a gesture, a touch, and intentional or unintentional. And like we might know from our own experience, a lot of the time microaggressions are unintentional. So it's hard in the moment to respond effectively because this person probably didn't even do it on purpose. We're all swimming around in this ableist, racist, sexist water. And we replicate those ideas, and they're automatic behaviors. They're not necessarily intentional. So microaggressions are really tricky. And, I'll tell you, for me, I never think about walking. I think about microaggressions all the time. They're inescapable. They're unavoidable. They stick with me. And there's really no way to respond to them. So, I just always feel like this vulnerability of like, when's it going to happen next, right? And they happen all the time, right? And they're not in my control. So there's one study I reference quite often, over 200 people involved in a qualitative study, disabled people, where they identified 8 domains, that's what the researchers call it, in which they experience microaggressions. Denial of identity, right? So that you might think about our slide with all of the words disability where dis is crossed out. We might think about the images where we don't see anybody's faces, right? Their heads are cut off, right? Denial of identity. That's not real. You can try harder, right? You can do better. That's not a real identity. Avoidance or separateness. I don't want to work in a group with this person. I don't want to be roommates with this person. Design really can also impact microaggressions as well, because it might be, I'm a chair user and the only place I can sit in this classroom is away from everyone else, right? I have to take an accommodated exam somewhere else. My parking is away. My entrance is different. Any number of ways. Disabled people are perceived as helpless. So unsolicited help came up a lot in this study. And then what the researchers call secondary gain is how the participants in the study described the non-disabled person who loves to feel helpful, right? I haven't done my good deed for the day. Let me grab the door for you. Desexualization, never being taken seriously in a romantic setting, not being perceived as a partner, a parent, a romantic, beautiful being. Denial of privacy can be anything from staring a little too long to invasive questions about what happened and what is that and why are you in a wheelchair and what, right, where'd you go for your test? Patronization and infantilization, condescending to disabled people, infantilizing them. And I mean, in student affairs, we might do this generally, right, with our kind of paternalistic attitude in many ways to students, but I would say it takes on another level of impact when you're looking at subordinated communities. But how many of those images that I shared were of children? The spread effect, you know, the impairment has no bounds. So that's why we speak loudly to blind people, right? We just don't know what to do with you. And then the participants sadly expressed feeling like second-class citizens, the access that was available making, like, kind of relegating them to a second-class experience, and feeling made to feel like a burden to their friends, family, or even on society. So this is where, you know, a lot of, I think, what we see in the media, what has been really embedded into the practice of higher education of one of many American systems. You know, these are some examples of where we see ableism in our day-to-day lives. I'm happy to send this to Christy because I have lots of examples of microaggressions that unfortunately we won't have time to get to. But at least we've defined them. And I would invite you, you know, to take a look at this when it's shared with you, or to think about, you know, how you might have bared witness to or participated in ableist microaggressions, you know, per these 8 domains. You know, another outcome of sharing all of those images, you know, and talking through them, there was some conversation in the chat, but, you know, is like, what do we take away? And what do we learn about disability, right, from the media? And I think we've learned a lot of, you know, maybe the basis or the reinforcement of some of those stereotypes, some of these microaggressions. I think we've also learned that disability looks like white people using wheelchairs. So in higher ed, it should be a goal of ours to do good outreach, right, to a variety of communities, to describe our services and our programs in ways where people feel welcome and included. And not just can perpetuate ideas that white people using wheelchairs are the ones that are going to come into our offices. Not enact, you know, those overly simplified walk again, see again, hear again, right? So challenging where we see these ideas come to life, really anywhere in society, but in particular in higher ed. I feel badly for rushing through this, but are there any kind of burning questions that anyone wants to either unmute for and pop on the mic, or to write into the chat? Thanks.
Amanda, I was just sharing that our department would be happy, Disability Resources, to present to any of you about these concepts further. We do have some talks that we do, not near as well as Amanda, but now that you've heard from her, we'd be happy to partner with you, or if you have questions, you can contact me. I know a lot of you, but also I just put our generic email address is disability@tamu.edu. And I think Megan will want to say something. I want to say thank you very much to Amanda. Thank you all for attending and being here. As you are already aware, after hearing her talk, Amanda is very well versed in this topic, both from a academic side and from a personal side. And so I appreciate her willingness to share that information with us.
Thank you.
And I'll let Megan talk for a sec.
Yes, thank you so much, Amanda. I'm regretting we only had you for an hour. I was like, you could go on, that would be wonderful. But we appreciate your time, and I absolutely think that you touched on some topics that I myself had not even thought about. And so I just appreciate you coming here and talking with us and sharing more. And I think you've definitely opened up some doors for us to walk through and to learn more. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and looking at the chat now, everyone's saying great presentation. So thank you so much, Amanda. And everyone, be expecting an email. I'll be sending out a link for an evaluation. This just helps us to better identify areas that we could improve and areas that we feel like we did a good job on. This is something that I will be sharing with Amanda as well. So anything you want to share with her via the evaluation, I'd love it if you would take that and take the time to complete the evaluation survey. And we encourage you guys to go to our website, the Accessibility in Aggie Land, just to review some of the other sessions. And thank you, Dr. Orr, for all of your work and support during this series. We are closing down the semester with this series. And so Amanda, you brought us home. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Megan, can I give a little sneak preview? Because this has been so successful and we've loved doing it, we are actually, Megan and I are meeting to start talking about a year-long, once a month presentation and just inviting a variety of speakers to come from across campus. So if you know someone or you are someone who's involved in accessibility, I know we had an instructional designer that's working on an accessibility and usability information. So if you would like to present or know someone or know a topic you would like to have a presentation on, please email Megan and let her know so that we can just continue this conversation year round. It never ends. So we would love to have you participating and giving us ideas for the future.
Thank you so much, Christy. I appreciate it. Y'all all have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Amanda, for your time. This was so
Thank you.